Well, good afternoon, everybody. Pastor David Taylor Black here, bringing to you our second message in our summer series as we look at the call of God on our lives. You know, last week, what an amazing week that was as we came together as Kiln Church and met in the Ledbury Community Centre and had a wonderful experience as we prepare to meet as a body each week from September. But for now, for these next 2 summer months, we're looking at the actions and attitudes of those men and women who were called by God, people who are just ordinary, yet they get to do extraordinary things for God. Last week, we started and looked at the life of Abraham. This week, we're going to be traveling a little bit further in the book of Genesis as we look at Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph is quite a long narrative. It's a tipsy-turvy seesaw kind of roller coaster kind of journey in Joseph's life. His life is peppered with ups and downs, highs and lows, tragedies and triumphs. And when we set our life in parallel with his, although our highs and lows may not be extreme, our lives can follow a similar rhythm from mountain tops to valley lows. So the story of Joseph spans 10 chapters in the book of Genesis, but I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of Joseph's life. Joseph was one of 12 sons of Jacob. He actually became the favored son of Jacob as he was born to Jacob's favorite wife, which was Rachel, in whom he had to pay a dowry of 14 years' labor to his uncle Laban. Joseph was born to Jacob when Jacob was 91. It seems that you're never too old. And he was the youngest of the brothers. That was until Benjamin rocked up, but sadly that was when Joseph's mum Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. Now Joseph was blessed by his parents. Genesis 37, he was given, if you'll remember, that colorful coat which has been famously known as Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat, thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical. Now, at the age of 17, he has a couple of visions. Now, today, we might put that down to hormones or hallucinations, but God was revealing his sovereign plan through a teenager. And we need to just take a moment to think about that. We must never underestimate our kids. God has called teenagers throughout all of history. You see it here in Joseph and then Joshua and Jeremiah and Samuel. Jesus's mother Mary was a teenager. Timothy was called as a young teenager. Now, it's been to the church's detriment that we write off our young people until they become of age or mature. But God sees the heart of young people that can still be pliable, that can be molded in a way that sometimes older folks' hearts can't be. That's why Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is for such of these young ones. Matthew 19. But be that as it may, the first of Joseph's vision that he had when he was just 17 years of age was one of bundles of grain or sheaves that were bowing down to Joseph's bundle of grain. His second vision was one of the sun and the moon and the stars that were bowing down to Joseph. Now, it was deplorable in the eyes of Joseph's family that the runt of the litter, could be so arrogant to suggest that one day his whole family will kneel before him. Genesis 37, 5-11. Now, if I were one of those brothers, I'd be thinking this delusional, egotistical, this boy who's suffering from some kind of sunstroke with all these fanciful ideas, and along with those visions and that coat, it fueled the brothers' hatred towards Joseph. So one day, with the brothers shepherding the family's flock at a place called Dothan, Jacob sends out Joseph to see how his brothers and the sheep are doing. Now, in spotting Joseph approaching, the brothers plotted a way to do away with the kid. First, they wanted to kill him and then hatch up some kind of cover-up story that he was mauled by wild beasts. But the eldest, the firstborn, Reuben, came to his rescue, suggesting that they'd rather throw him into a pit, which would have been some kind of well or cavern. Now, Reuben had it in his mind to rescue Joseph later, but behind Reuben's back, the other 9 brothers spotted some Ishmaelite merchants coming down and going on to Egypt. Now, who were the Ishmaelites? Now, you have to go back a little bit and go back to Abraham. Ishmael was the son of Hagar. Hagar was the servant of Abraham's wife, Sarah, whom Abraham then had relations with in his attempt to speed up and to fulfill the promise that God had given to Abraham about having an heir. So Ishmael is Abraham's son from Hagar, but Ishmael in the Quran is considered as a prophet, and Muslims and Christians can trace our ancestry back to Abraham, but at Isaac and Ishmael, the path of faith divide. Now, be that as it may, Judah thought that it would be better to make a bit of money from selling Joseph rather than leave him, to quote Boris Johnson, to die in a ditch. So that's what they did. They sold him, and they told their dad that Joseph had died by the dingoes and dogs of the desert. Now, that is really quite shocking. And for some of us, that would be really unforgivable. At 17 years of age, Joseph was human trafficked, traded by his brothers. But as fortune would have it, under the favor of God, Joseph landed on his feet when he became the servant of Potiphar. Potiphar was an officer in Pharaoh's court in Egypt. And now Joseph is blessed in the house of a pagan. He had everything that he could want. He was put in charge of everything in this top politician's household. There was nothing in Potiphar's house that was off limits to Joseph except his wife. And at this point, I wonder if Joseph was thinking that he's actually struck it rich. But here's the thing about calling. If God has destined you for something higher, you can't stay where you are. And God had something in mind for Joseph that was much higher than being the servant of Potiphar. However, sometimes to get to the penthouse, you have to go via the basement. And that's what would happen to Joseph. And that is also the story of Jesus, who is exalted today because he humbled himself. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, because Jesus emptied himself out for the sins of the world. So sometimes to get up to the top, you've got to go by the way of the bottom. Now, Joseph had spent 10 years in the house of Potiphar, serving faithfully. But then the bubble burst and his world would be ripped from beneath his feet at the lies and the false accusations of Potiphar's wife. Joseph is now 28 years of age. He's rugged in looks. He's a good-looking guy. He's in the prime of his life, and he has now become the infatuation of Potiphar's wife. And so when the coast is clear, she pounces on Joseph like a cougar, desiring her prey. But Joseph was such a righteous man, even though he was away from the promised land, he's such a righteous man that he wanted nothing to do with her sordid, solicited suggestions, which was, come lie with me. Potiphar's wife wanted to have sex with Joseph. And some men would find that hard to resist, but not Joseph. And now he runs for his life and he flees that encounter. But now she's become a woman who is scorned. She's had her ego dented. And so now she thinks that he is going to suffer for his resisting her. almost like his head for her humiliation. So she spins a yarn, and then he's thrown into another pit. And again, even in the most trying of times, Joseph is favored by the Lord. He was blessed by his parents. He was blessed by Potiphar, and now he's blessed in the prison. As the prison warden makes Joseph responsible for all that goes on in the prison. So much so that the warden paid no attention to that which Joseph was overseeing in the prison, Genesis 39. But whilst in the prison, he's got other prisoners around him, and there are two prisoners there. And this is the cup bearer to the king of Pharaoh, and also the chief baker. And these two guys, they have a dream. And Joseph is skilled with the gifting of being able to interpret dreams. And he says, well, to the cupbearer, that he's going to get his position back in Pharaoh's court. He's going to hang out with Pharaoh in just 3 days' time, whereas the chief baker was going to get strung up in 3 days' time, and he's going to be killed. He's going to be hanged. And Joseph was spot on with his interpretation. So Joseph gives all the credit to God. He only asked the cupbearer one thing, and that was to remember him, which sadly the cupbearer forgot Joseph when he was freed. So Joseph ends up spending 2 years locked up inside a prison for an injustice. That is until something is going down in the palace, where God is now giving Pharaoh peculiar kind of dreams. And this troubled Pharaoh, but the problem was all the psychics in Egypt couldn't interpret the dream. And then there is that light bulb moment as the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And Joseph is called then into Pharaoh's presence to interpret the dream. And Joseph, again, he gives honor to God. And he interprets and predicts the next 14 years of the social and economic climate, not just in Egypt, but globally, with those, as he interprets, the 7 thin cows eating up the 7 plump cows, and the 7 ears of grain swallowing up the 7 thin ears of grain. And that was interpreted that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of poverty, Genesis 41. Now, not only does Joseph give an interpretation, he provides a solution, and following which he is recognized as being the wisest man in Egypt. So Joseph goes from the pit up and now into the palace, just as I was saying, before you go up, you have to go down. But now he's gone up to the palace from the pit. And again, he is tremendously blessed in the palace. The favor of God is upon him. Now, what we should see from this is that when life sucks, you can still be in the favor of God. Now, Joseph here, he's 30 years old when he takes his position in the palace of Pharaoh. Now, let's move the story on a little bit. 2 years into the famine, so we come to Genesis 45 now. Joseph has been second in command of all of Egypt for about 9 years. So that's where we're at. Let's change scene and go up north, go back into the land of Canaan, because that's where stomachs are beginning to rumble. We're in a famine, a global famine, 2 years into it. And up in Canaan, Jacob and his brothers and his sons are starving. So he sends them, his 10 sons, to buy grain, Genesis 42. The youngest son, Benjamin, he stays at home at this time. So Joseph is 39 years of age at this time, and 22 years have passed since his brothers trafficked him. Now we see through chapters 42 and 44 that the brothers, they still carry the guilt of what they did to Joseph. And then when they arrive innocently in Egypt looking to buy grain, they didn't recognize Joseph. Now, why would they? But Joseph identifies them immediately. The memories of 22 years ago have not been erased. And that's where you can see that you can forgive without forgetting. Joseph hadn't forgotten what had happened, so he couldn't entrust himself to the brothers just yet. He wanted to see if these brothers had changed in some way, to see if there was some sense of remorse or regret or recognition of the wrong that they had done to Joseph. So Joseph, through those chapters, he tests his brothers twice. He accuses them of being spies. Now, people often say, don't they, and you've heard it, we've all heard it, oh, you should forgive and forget. I simply believe that's nonsensical Christian sentimentalism aimed at condemning the victim. Now, we must forgive 100% of the time, but to entrust oneself who has wronged you, hurt you, it takes time to develop that trust again, and even when the heart can forgive. And this is what Joseph is doing. He's just trying to test them to see if he can entrust himself to them again. But be that as it may, eventually Joseph, in a great display of emotion, reveals himself to his brothers. After 22 years of carrying that pain, it all comes out in a flood of emotion. You read Genesis 45, 1-3, and he pours it out, weeping and wailing, even so that people in his court can hear. Now, at the time of those painful experiences that Joseph went through, he couldn't understand the reasons why God had allowed those things to happen to him, and he'd done nothing wrong. But God used all that pain and the circumstances of his life, Joseph's life, ultimately to save a nation and to keep the covenant promises alive. And when we look at that in context to our own lives, sometimes we won't know why we have to go through the circumstances we have to go through. And sometimes those things will not be revealed to us until we get to the other side. But if you can see that God was turning all things together for good for Joseph, then you can trust that he will do the same for you and I. Now, as a result of that reunion and that reconciliation that Jesus had with his brothers, Joseph relocates his family to Egypt, to the rich pasture lands of Goshen. Now, by the time Joseph's dad, who is Jacob, he arrives in Egypt, he's 130 years of age, and he lives there for 17 years with peace before he dies, with peace and with his family all around him. But when he dies, the brothers, they get a bit nervous that Joseph's benevolence will stop. And so they meet with Joseph, pleading with him to forgive them for what they did. And it's with tears in Joseph's eyes where he uttered those immortal words that has carried many people through sleepless nights. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, to save lives. Genesis 50:20. Now, for all the horrors of Joseph's life, he was blessed. He was blessed by his parents. He was blessed by Potiphar. He was blessed in the prison, and he was blessed in the palace. Now, something that will help all of us. When we go through hellish experiences, it is being able to recognize where heaven is intervening, even during those times. Now, we might not understand why the things are the way that they are. And in an attempt to try and work all that stuff out, it's just going to make your head explode. But what we can do as Joseph did, and that was to lean into God. Joseph, he saw everything as being interweaved with God's sovereign plan. So, what was it about Joseph's life? That's a synopsis of Joseph. But what was it about his life, his attitudes and his actions that we can learn from as one who is called and commissioned by God? Well, first, let's look at where we perceive Joseph's success story. Now, a lot of people would see that Joseph was successful in that he was able to foresee and plan and deliver a multinational feeding program. And if he did that in this country, he'd be knighted for it. But God sees Joseph's success in something quite different, in these things. God sees Joseph as successful in that he was able to hold on to God in a foreign land, in that he was able to minister within and under adversity, that he was not prepared to blame God for the circumstances of his life, that he was going to trust God for the future, that he wouldn't retaliate against his brothers when he had the power to do so after 22 years of hurt and pain, and that he would have the heart to forgive and then the will to provide and care for his family. That was a success story for Joseph. Joseph's success, as measured by heaven, is not in the position that he held, nor in the projects that he managed, but in the person that he was. It matters not how big or small your or my call is, whether our commission is to Lebanon or to Ledbury. What matters is the position of your heart before God. And there are some really significant attitudes and actions of Joseph's life. Joseph, he never lost sight of the Lord when the chips were down. When the world wasn't all as it should be for Joseph, he did not forsake the Lord. You know that phenomenon of gravity, what goes up must come down. Well, in the Christian context, those who go down will be raised up. And that's always been the Christian way, that we go down before going up. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it only remains a single grain. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. John 12:24. When God calls you, he will call you to a road that will have many ups and downs, highs and lows. And that sense of complete humbling or emptying oneself, just like Jesus did on the cross. But when we do that, when we die to ourselves, when we surrender to his will, we must remember there is going to be a resurrection. There is always the dawning of a new day, as there was for Joseph on many examples. God exalts the humble. What we must see and love about Joseph is that he never blamed God. Even though there were so many injustices, he never got angry with God. So many Christians shake their fist at God. What? You don't love me, God, otherwise I wouldn't be going through this. When the chips are down, it's so tempting to say, God doesn't care about me. God doesn't love me. If he loved me, I wouldn't be going through this situation. Where is God now in my darkness? And maybe you're feeling that. Maybe there is that real sense of pain, injustice, frustration. But this is where we have to dial in and tune in to Joseph's heart and his attitude. And even like the psalmist, we can be real with God. We must be real. But I think there's a line. The disciples, Peter, Paul, Silas, and Joseph were all in prison, but they never crossed the line. Stephen and James were martyred, but they never crossed the line to shake their fist at God. They just humbly trusted that God is sovereign in control. You see, when you're in the valley, all you have to hold on to is the vine. And when you hold on to the vine, you trust it will grow and you'll get out of the valley. At times in your call, in your Christian ministry, you will be wronged for doing right. Joseph did all the right things. He obeyed his parents, but he ends up in a pit for it. Joseph fled from temptation, but he ends up in prison for it. Joseph interpreted the dream of a cupbearer, but he gets forgotten. One of the casualties of doing right is being wronged, repaying good for evil, as it talks about in the Bible. And consider Jesus for all the good that he did when he walked the length and the breadth of Israel, healing and feeding and setting people free, only to be crucified at the hands of those people. So in ministry, in your call, in your commission, there is a time for tears. You know, when you look at this narrative of Joseph, about 6 times in the story through Genesis, he weeps. He weeps when he sees his brothers for the first time. He weeps when he sees his younger brother, Benjamin. He weeps when he makes himself known to all of his brothers in Genesis 45 in that situation when all of Egypt hear him. He weeps when he sees his father Jacob, and when then he learns of Jacob's death in Genesis 50. And then he weeps again when his brothers seem to lose their trust in Joseph. Now, it's good to cry. It just means that we're human. Jesus wept multiple times. But notice when Joseph didn't weep. He didn't weep when he was betrayed by his brothers. He didn't weep when he was sold as a slave. He didn't weep when he's lied about by Potiphar's wife, or when he's thrown into the prison, or when he's forgotten by the cupbearer. Most of us would fall into self-pity and we would cry ourselves to sleep. But Joseph replaced his tears in those situations for trust, to trust in the Lord. And it was in those times, which is another positive attitude of Joseph. In the difficult times, Joseph took the opportunities. He continued to minister in the face of adversity. Joseph, he exercised a simple prison ministry. It wasn't full-time Christian mission, but he was prepared to give God's word into that context, which would ultimately result in blessing in his freedom and blessing Egypt and the nations surrounding. One of the things is, and this is the final thing, that we need to remember in relation to our calling and our commission is to hold on to the dreams. Hold on to those dreams that you've had, that God has put in your mind, in your heart, and in how you've been gifted to serve him and follow him. Joseph held on to the dream until its fulfillment. He was 17 when he was given those visions that the family would bow down to him in Genesis 37. He serves in Pharaoh's court when he's 30. There's 7 years of plenty, then there's 2 years of famine before he sees his brothers. So it's taken between 22 and 25 years for that dream, those dreams that Joseph had, to be fulfilled. And the point I want to make here is, don't give up on your dreams. And even perhaps remember the words of the Apostle Paul, who said that God who began a good work in you, will bring it to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. That is, until the Lord comes back for his church. Don't give up on the dreams that God has planted in your heart and in your mind. Now, Joseph, he truly was a great man who was called by God. He's a great example of being a faithful servant amidst the highs and the lows of life. Many people wronged him. He was attacked by his brothers. He was sold by the Ishmaelites. He was lied about by Potiphar's wife. He was condemned by Potiphar. He was forgotten by the cupbearer. But he was never forgotten by God. Even with all that opposition and with all that injustice, all the wrongs that were done to him, he sees God in the midst. And this is a verse that he ends with, that we should etch in our hearts. What they meant for evil, God means for good. And I pray that the Lord would open your heart to receive all that he wants to speak into your heart today, in the context of perhaps where you're struggling, perhaps where you've wanted to throw in the towel, perhaps where you've wanted to just step away and give up. And that you might actually now look at the life of Joseph and how God had carried him through, giving him highs and lows, but enabling him to run the race and to fulfill his calling. And he was indeed blessed in the end. And I pray that the Lord will bless you as you step in faith and walk out for him. Well, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for dialing in and tuning in with me today. Next week, I'm not online. We're going to be meeting somewhere else, whilst we have our social gathering, a cream tea gathering. Do dial into Kiln Church social media, Facebook, and hear about that. And it's good to see you, but I'll be back online in a couple of weeks' time. God bless you, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.